All right, John, thanks very much for joining us. Could you just start by introducing yourself and what industry you're from?
John Kirwan, I'm the CEO of the Royal Flying Doctor Service Tasmanian section. Actually, Royal Flying Doctor Service is a bit of a hybrid. That is, we're both a charity, an aeromedical provider and a primary healthcare provider. So we actually operate across 3 different sectors.
Great. And what led you to become the CEO of a not-for-profit organisation?
I've worked, interestingly enough, in my career in industrial relations, trade unions, government, and now the Flying Doctors. I'd have to say all of them are not-for-profit because in most areas, particularly in government, we're struggling always to make a surplus or budget. But the not-for-profit sector, particularly the charity sector, it was a unique opportunity in Tasmania because they'd ended up with a bequest that allowed them to appoint the first CEO, and getting involved in primary care and a bottom-up approach was actually an interesting challenge for me.
So, moving on from that, we're going to be talking today about change management. So, why do you think it's important to understand change?
I probably come from a philosophy that if you're not changing and improving, and if you're staying still, you're going backwards. So there's very few areas where I think that doing nothing, other than maybe as a short-term option, is actually a good option. I think continuous improvement should always be inherently part of what we're doing, which means change. Sometimes there's large changes that are forced on us, having worked for a long time in government, a change of policy, a global economic crisis. All of these things come along that are often just unpredicted and are quite difficult to manage at the time. But I think change in itself is inherently part of what we are as humans and what our organisation should be doing, striving to improve efficiency and improve the services we deliver.
So why do you think that some people actually resist change?
I think that it's a case of how change is managed, and I think that some people, it's probably not part of their comfort zone. I think it does go a little bit to whether people are prepared to take a little bit of risk and go into the unknown. But again, I do think it's very much about communication and explaining the need for change.
And what actions have you taken to deal with resistance to change? Or have you had any resistance to change in your career?
Yes, there's been resistance for change, particularly where people are inherently set in their ways. An example would be when I was in the Northern Territory, introducing a very strong, proactive Aboriginal employment strategy amongst the government sector. It would be fair to say that in a lot of the more traditional white male technical areas, they just didn't see the value for it. And there was some probably embedded racism behind that thinking. And that was difficult, particularly when my senior program manager in that area was young, articulate Aboriginal female. It was clear that when you walk into a meeting and the only female in the room was in fact the one taking the minutes and making the coffee, which I find just a little bit antiquated. So that created a challenge for us in a range of areas. Interestingly enough, in some of those areas, once we got through some of those barriers, they were probably some of our strongest supporters because they actually did get the value of actually getting diversity and employing local people for just practical reasons, such as, it was better to do that than continual rotation of people from down south who didn't stay long.
So you had a quite broad career. Can you provide another example where you've actually implemented a change, and what was the process you undertook and how did you go about it?
I'm very much into systems thinking. I like a systems approach, and I like the approach that people understand what the big picture is, because I think people will always react better if they can actually see the end game, even if they know they're only a part of that cog. Health is a good example of a very large, complex organisation. I've always described health as an economic sort of Rubik's Cube because it's labour-intensive, capital-intensive, transaction-intensive. So when I started at the Launceston General Hospital as the CEO, we had to undergo a range of changes. We were facing being subject, instead of block funding and historical funding, and effectively historical deficit funding, because we rarely didn't balance budgets or go into a surplus. But the Commonwealth was introducing activity-based funding, which was basically an average price across Australia. So we needed to understand that, and we needed to understand our costs, and we needed the staff to understand what that actually was going to mean for us. At the same time, we had the global economic crisis, so there was less money. At the same time, we had the biggest capital works building program Launceston's ever seen, and we were facing a number of other challenges, particularly with IT and workforce, some of which didn't eventuate. The foreshadowed nursing shortage didn't occur, interestingly enough, I suspect, because of the global economic crisis. That is, staff couldn't afford to retire in an ageing workforce. So the approach I took, which I borrowed from work of Alistair Mant, who I strongly recommend, he worked very early in his career with Sir William Hudson, who was the engineer behind the Snowy Mountains scheme. And what Alistair was influenced by, it's in his book Intelligent Leadership, that Sir William Hudson would require the engineers and the shift managers to meet with each of their shifts regularly and explain to them what the big picture of the Snowy Mountains scheme was. And they used diagrams, given the Snowy Mountains scheme, as Tasmanians would understand, because a lot of them came from that to then make the hydro work in Tasmania and are still here as their descendants. There was something like 30 or 40 different nationalities and languages. So they used diagrams to say, this is where we are, this is what we're building, we're underground, we're doing this, we're building these power stations, we're diverting the Snowy River to drive this hydro. So that was really quite powerful as telling the picture. And I often find in health that we deal with different parts of the body. We're a subspecialty model, we're highly educated, but rarely do we necessarily understand all of it. And certainly we don't understand the financing and some of the strategic. So I spent a fair bit of time both trying to get all of those pressures down onto one page. It ended up being a double A4, whatever that is, a B2 or whatever, B1. So it didn't quite get down to one A4 page because it was a bit complex, looked a bit like an octopus. But there was 4 or 5 major drivers, and I made a point of going around to each of the areas, each of the shifts in my first 6 months and handing it out and explaining it and answering questions. Some of those were very quick meetings, but some of those were very long meetings, and then following up if people had any question. So they understood that the rules were changing, that we needed to change, otherwise we'd be in trouble, and the opportunities that arose, particularly because we were fortunate enough to start with what was an $11 million capital works program, which we grew to over 120 million. So we were able to rebuild a large part of the hospital at the same time and position us well for the future in the next 30 or so years. So using the picture, using the story, explaining why staying still or doing what we've always done wasn't going to be possible, but also allowing them to speak to the CEO directly in that, I think, and I learnt that out of that work of Sir William Hudson, who was a very clever New Zealand engineer, interestingly enough, because I think that helps in a complex organisation where people are involved with different parts of it.
Great. Do you have any tips for our students on change management?
I think all of the research and experience is that people will say that people don't communicate enough. You do staff satisfaction surveys and others. What I learnt, and I learnt it more actually from coaching and sports coaching than I did actually necessarily management, but I took it into management. I remember when I was coaching schoolboy rowing and I was doing my level 2 coaching certificates, and I was speaking to a very experienced coach who'd been coaching at the Australian level, and I was basically complaining about this crew that I knew had the real potential but just weren't getting it. And he made a very telling point and said, the art of coaching is not them learning from you, but in fact you being able to communicate with them. And the challenge is, if you're talking about a schoolboy 8 where you've got 8 rowers and a coxswain, I said you've actually probably got to work out at least 9 different messages to be able to get it through. But your challenge is to keep working on how you get your messaging right until they get it. And that to me was a bit of a light bulb moment. You go, well, hang on, it's actually not their job to learn from me, but my job to teach them. And how do I then package it so it actually... And that then helped when I then went on and did other things like understanding some of the different personality typing and the different tools you can use. And even just the obvious differences between introverts and extroverts, the obvious differences between generally men and women, and the differences in age groups, and using things like Myers-Briggs and other tools. It did help me, particularly when you deal, again, predominantly most of my working life's been in and around health. You've got monocultures. They're easy to work through, but they're both strengths and weaknesses. But once you understand that a physician is different to a surgeon in their thinking, and even the subgroups are different again, it does help you in respect to how you manage circumstances, because some people just want action, some people want a discussion and an informed thing, but putting the two together, where people just want to get on and do it, e.g. a surgeon's interested in scalpel to skin, getting on with it, doing what they're doing, and they get very frustrated when they can't, where the physician does actually want a broader discussion because their work is probably often not as straightforward as that. So you do need to actually work out what's the best tool in the toolkit to use.
Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
As I said, I just go back to the fact that I think change is inherently part of us. I know we now talk about the big digital disruption. I've been around long enough, and at that stage, interestingly enough, I was working for the Bank Employees Union. I did it for about 18 months, and we had the big bank deregulation, which was when we went from large, cumbersome, closed shops, everyone was compulsory member of a union, to a deregulated industry, thanks to Paul Keating and the deregulation that he pioneered, which I still think, as said, stood the Australian economy in a very sound position. But we thought that was going to be the end of the world, and I still remember the campaigns by some of the other unions, like the old Federated Clerks Union, about technology. Everyone's only going to be working 20 hours a week. Robots are going to take jobs. And even the Bank Employees Union was opposing automatic tellers because it was going to take tellers' jobs. It's interesting. I think things are going to change. How they're going to change, I suspect we don't really know. We thought we knew then, but obviously they got it wrong. But, look at the changes in the technology. In those days, banking, you went to the bank manager, you shined your shoes, you wore your best suit, and you went cap in hand. Now they'll come out and see you all days of the night, and you can get competitive rates and negotiate. And so the technology and the world of work is changing. And I think that's an interesting challenge for all of us, for managers particularly. And I won't go into the intergenerational ones, but there are issues there that have effect. I know in health, for example, we know that when we replaced some of our senior doctors, they were all used to doing 68 hours a week. If they were on call, they'd come in. That's not necessarily the same all the way through the system now. So there is different standards, there's different expectations.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Susie.